Greetings, this is Ruby the Nostalgic Catholic with another Isaac Asimov short story review. Now, this story appears in only two places, the second of which is this collection of his short stories, The Bicentennial Man and Other Stories. The other place is fantastically obscure. Um, Most companies, industry corporations and so forth, like to put out some sort of like a magazine or a newspaper or regular brochure or something, just kind of discussing what's going on in the company to kind of, make investors a little more willing to keep their money in there or buy more of their shares, or just encourage interest, and maybe also to be kind of a encouragement to some of their employees and so forth. Hey, you're working with a really great company and we're doing a lot of really neat things, even if you're not. So I remember when I was working in one of these companies, we had a company paper that came out about every month, and they had a lot of neat stuff. They had stuff they were doing in Antarctica. Had stuff doing in the foreign, watching the skies for foreign missile launches, and all sorts of really cool, telescopes and really interesting stuff. And a company known as Bell Telephone Labs, they they run a lot of telephone lines, and I think they also made some telephones and so forth. They have a little magazine of their own, and Isaac Asimov wrote a story for them, and it appeared in there. Well, these kinds of magazines or papers from corporations have got to be the most fantastically ephemeral products there are out there. I think they're even rarer than ancient gospel tracts. I mean, they're really rare. The sole remaining copy might probably be somewhere in Boston University Library, along with all the original copies of anything else of Asimov's. That's probably the only surviving copy left in the whole planet. Or who knows? Maybe some employee has a pack rat and has a bunch of these old zines in his pile that get thrown out when he goes, and none of his descendants, oh, that's a pile of crap, and they just throw it out. I mean, that's how rare this is. The story, however, appears in here, and it is simply called Old Fashioned. So, what is Old Fashioned? Well, let's see what little bit we have about this, and then the story itself, of course. He has a short introduction to this story, which reads thus. This next one was requested by Bell Telephone Magazine over an excellent lunch. What they wanted was a 3,000-word story centering on a problem in communications. There were two broad requirements. First, that it be farther out than any of the methods of communication now under development by Bell Telephone, and second, that I not postulate an end to the requirements for communications corporations. As it happened, Kim Armstrong, the editor of the magazine, who was at the lunch, was an extraordinarily charming woman, but I would have agreed to tackle the story anyway, because before the lunch was over, I had a plot outline safely tucked away in my head. Footnote here. People ask me sometimes if I keep a notebook on me at all times to jot down ideas. I do, but it's inside my head, and therefore never gets mislaid. I got to work on it in October 1975. Ms. Armstrong liked it when it was done, and it appeared in the February 1976 issue of the magazine. Yeah. Anyway, so we have two guys. In fact, we actually have something kind of loosely analogous, actually, to the Marooned on Vesta scenario. Yeah, that takes us back a ways. These two guys are in orbit around a pea-sized black hole that they just found somewhere inside the asteroid belt of our solar system. I think we've since learned that actually the smaller the black holes are, the stronger they are, and you wouldn't be in a simple orbit around one. If it was that close, it would probably be ready to suck the whole solar system into itself. and not even expand by an attometer in diameter when it's done so. But apparently the bigger ones actually, strangely enough, ironically enough, are more gentle and I won't quite say approachable, but whatever near akin to that you can say as far as black holes. But who knew this in 1975? Anyway, they're in orbit around, along with some other assortment of rocks and stuff, a tiny black hole, so small that it didn't even get spotted until they almost collided with it and are now kind of trapped in a very tight orbit. They can be rescued from it. They're not really quite the event horizon, but it's going to take more energy than they have, more fuel, whatever, than they have in their rocket. In short, there's no way out, and there is enough of the distortion that if they try to send a signal and maybe the radio is dead, it might take a couple of years for the signal to, at least several months for the signal to get out of the gravity well and finally proceed, onto where they hope it would go. Like somebody who might get it and say, "Help! We're in trouble! We're in orbit around a black hole!" So they have to kind of figure out what to do and how they're going to tell somebody that they're there. And they come up with an interesting solution, I dare say. And that's the idea they had to communicate. Well, you got all these rocks kind of floating around. You guess you have some way to gather them up. And, maybe they're outside in a spacesuit. The space isn't so twisted, it's going to twist you out of shape. Or if it were, it'd be as twisted inside the rocket as outside. So, anyway, apparently it's not so bad. You're not so far in the well that you're beyond its event horizon. So you could hypothetically escape, or at least be saved or rescued from it. But what you can do is you can throw a rock, say a piece of an asteroid, right directly into the thing. And every time you do, that's a big chunk. These little invisible particles are falling into it all the time, and they look like little glinting stars that you just barely see for a moment as they, really enter the event horizon and pass from our universe to, a universe of no return. But it's like the energy of the compression and stretching and whatever happens to them as they're vanishing over that horizon, makes a brief spark. Well, what they could do is they could throw a rock into it, because they got a bunch of rocks kind of also in orbit around along their spacecraft. So they get the idea of throwing rocks into it at steady intervals, hoping somebody will see that, and maybe also discover that these, little flashes that would be seen out there are happening, A, very regularly, and B, crossing slowly across a little bit of the sky, such that somebody say, "This is moving. This isn't way out yonder, and it's not Barnard's star, which also moves at an almost detectable rate. This is inside our, maybe like our asteroid belt." And they go, "Oh, something's there." And maybe figure out someone. Well, if you can make these flashes happen more or less at command, you can communicate by throwing rocks into a black hole. I've given away the most things. It's nicely written. It's tautly written. It reads swiftly and quickly. It's just a few pages, and that's really about all there is to it. He also has a postscript to the story. Since it is kind of similar to Marooned off Vesta, you are in the asteroid belt. You're kind of stranded in a tough situation. You need help. So it's kind of a puzzle box adventure, sort of like Marooned off Vesta was. Incidentally, it may occur to some of my gentle readers, are readers always gentle, that there is a certain similarity between this story and my first published story, Marooned off Vesta, which appeared in print 37 years earlier. Wow, that goes back a few weeks. In each story, two men are trapped on a spaceship. Actually, there was three men on Marooned off Vesta, but maybe there's no quibble in that. On a spaceship wrecked in the asteroid belt and must use their ingenuity to devise a way of escaping what looked like certain death. Of course, the resolutions are completely different, and it was in my mind to demonstrate some of the changes in our outlook on the universe that took place in those 37 years by producing in 1976 a resolution that would have been inconceivable in 1939. So, I think I've kind of summarized the story, given some of its background, a little bit of Isaac Asimov's follow-up. I only have one small article I'd like to just bring up briefly. This actually refers to the previous video on his story, Good Taste. It turns out when I was showing this illustration of the story, The Good Taste, I mentioned that there was this little blurb here, but I neglected to read it. It's short, sweet, and mostly is just a brief biography of Isaac Asimov, so it's not too inappropriate to read it now. This story, well, the Good Taste story, appeared in a small booklet last year. However, the circulation of that publication was so limited, and since we felt that it deserved wider circulation, we present it here. The author was born in Russia, moved to Brooklyn when he was 3, with some help from his parents, lived for many years in Boston, and now lives in New York City with his charming wife, Janet. There, that's it. So, see a little biographical thing and a little background on the story. Obviously, since that day, it found another place in the winds of change. But getting back to the Bicentennial Man, we've already had old-fashioned. Well, there is something old-fashioned. I'll leave that as a non-spoiler to give you what's old-fashioned about trying to communicate by throwing rocks into a black hole. But there is, and if you want to know what it is, you gotta read the story. And unless you've got something that probably almost doesn't exist anywhere, it means buying the Bicentennial Man to get at it. All right, that's all I have on the old-fashioned.